Welcome back to Back Road Creeps. Settle in, get comfortable, and let these stories carry you somewhere quiet. Every story here is made for one purpose, to help you drift off and fall asleep. No jump scares, just slow, dark, and cozy storytelling right before bed. If you enjoy what I do here, please like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. I love seeing where you all are from. I don't run any ads on this channel. Not a single one. These videos are completely free for you, and I want to keep it that way. If you'd ever like to support me financially, I have a Patreon. The link is pinned in the comments and in the description below. Even the smallest support means everything and keeps this channel alive. Now get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let's get started. So I was doing field work for my geology thesis, Eastern Oregon, out past where most people go. This was fall of 2019. The project was basically just road documentation, old mining access roads from the mid-century operations up there, cataloging erosion patterns, taking samples, photographing any infrastructure that was still standing. Low-stakes stuff. My advisor, Dr. Heller, he'd been doing this kind of regional survey work for about 30 years. He was supposed to be out there with me the whole week, but he rolled his ankle pretty bad on the second day coming down off a loose section of road. Not broken, but bad enough that he couldn't manage the elevation. So he stayed down with the truck at the lower trailhead, and I went up to finish the upper section alone. We had a satellite communicator for check-ins. It was fine. It was a normal work situation. The upper section was maybe 4 miles of road that switched backed up toward an old or processing site. The road itself was the thing I was there to document. Not the site, just how the road had held up, where it was washing out, what the substrate looked like in cross-section where it had eroded. I had maybe 2 days of work up there. I set up camp on a flat section of the ridge just off the road where there was enough level ground and some rock windbreak on the north side. The first day was fine. I walked the road in both directions from camp, took photographs, made notes, flagged a few spots where I wanted to take samples in the morning. The excavation work up there was old, from the 50s mostly, and it had left the ridgeline pretty torn up. Long cuts in the hillside where they'd gone after or seams, rusted cable hardware here and there, a few vertical shafts that were just open, not capped or fenced or anything. I marked those on my map because you had to. There was a mineral smell when the wind came from certain directions, which made sense given what had been pulled out of the ground up there. Sulfide deposits. Nothing strange about it. That first evening was when I noticed the quiet. Not right away. I was cooking, making notes, doing regular things. But at some point I realized I hadn't heard anything in a while. Not wind, the wind was there. But insects, nothing. No movement in the brush. I had been out in the field enough times to know that places have their own noise floor, their own baseline, and this one was just low. I figured elevation, maybe the time of year, maybe the disruption from all the old excavation. I noted it and kept working. The trenches I'd been finding, I want to back up and explain those because they matter. I had noticed them on the access road coming in, before I even set up camp. I thought at first they were from heavy equipment, something with a wide wheelbase dragging a skid plate. They crossed the road at perpendicular angles, shallow, wider than a standard truck track. Maybe 18 inches wide, I'd say. Not deep, maybe 2 or 3 inches. The thing that made me stop and actually look at them was the consistency. The width was the same every time, and they were spaced out over a long stretch of road. Not clustered near where equipment would have been parked or turned around, but appearing and disappearing over miles of road, always the same width, always roughly perpendicular to the road's direction. I took photographs and put it in my notes under a question mark. I figured maybe it was a logging operation, a cable drag system, something I wasn't familiar with. Oregon has a lot of different extraction history in that kind of terrain. I wasn't a logging guy. I wrote it down and kept going. The second day I finished my measurements and started taking samples from the road sections I'd flagged. The work was straightforward. I checked in with Heller on the communicator around noon, and he was fine, ankle was down, he'd been reading. I told him I'd probably have everything I needed by the following morning, and we could drive out by midday. That afternoon I found 2 more trench marks I hadn't seen on the way in, on a section of road I'd already walked, which meant either I'd missed them or they were new. They were on the uphill side of a switchback, in a section of the road with loose, decomposed granite surface. I could see them clearly. The edges were clean. I took photographs and measured them. 18 inches. Same as the others. I looked at the dirt carefully. I don't know what I was looking for exactly. I couldn't determine anything useful from it. The surface was too loose to hold detail. I noted the location and kept going. That evening the fog came in below me. This was maybe 2 hours before full dark. It filled the basin below the ridge, thick and even moving slow. I was eating outside because the weather had been clear. I could see the fog line from where I was sitting, and it was sharp-edged, which I'd seen before in that kind of valley topography, where cold air pools and humidity stratifies. Normal phenomenon. I watched it for a while because there was nothing else to look at. The pebble sound started, I think, around the time the fog settled. Small sounds, downhill, random intervals. Loose rock tumbling, the kind of noise you get when something moves through scree. I thought deer. The timing was right for deer moving at dusk. I didn't pay close attention to it at first. I finished eating and started washing the pot. The sounds continued. I'm not sure exactly when I noticed the pattern, that they were moving laterally rather than approaching or receding. I stopped washing and listened. Another rattle of pebbles, maybe 60 degrees to my left from the last one, downslope. Then a few minutes later, another one, further around. It was a wide arc, whatever it was. It wasn't crossing toward me. It was moving around the lower perimeter of the ridge. I sat with that for a bit. I got my headlamp. The sounds continued at intervals, circling. I didn't go down to look. The slope below me was loose shale, and it would have been a bad idea in low light. And also whatever was moving down there was large enough to move rock, and I didn't have a clear read on what it was. So I stayed at camp and kept track of the direction. It went all the way around. That took maybe an hour and a half, the full circuit. Then it stopped. That was the part one kept turning over. The full circuit. Deer don't do that. They cross, they graze, they spook and run. They don't make a slow, consistent loop around something. I thought about predators doing that, coyotes, but coyotes make noise and travel faster. I didn't have a good answer. I wrote it down. I slept okay. I woke up once, and there was nothing happening, no sounds, so I went back to sleep. The trench was there in the morning. That's the thing I'm still not sure how to account for. I've gone back over this a lot. I know that trench was not there when I set up camp, because I set up the tent line carefully, and I would have put stakes into it or at minimum noticed it. It crossed directly under where my tent was. Fresh enough that dirt was still sliding in at the edges when I looked at it in the morning. Same width as the others. I packed up the tent and stood there looking at it. It ran from the upslope side of the road cut, across the road surface, and disappeared into the loose material on the downslope side. Consistent depth, consistent width, consistent angle. No debris at the edges, just compression at the sides. I checked in with Heller earlier than usual. Told him I was packing up and coming down. He asked if something was wrong, and I said no, just got what I needed. Which was mostly true. I had the data I came for. I finished breaking down camp and walked out. On the way down I looked at the trench marks I'd photographed the day before. They were still there, but I thought, and I could be wrong about this, the edges looked older. More slumped. I may have been projecting. I took a few more photographs. The noise happened when I was about a mile from the lower trailhead. I'd been hearing nothing the whole walk down, same absent noise floor as the days before. Then this sound came from somewhere below the ridge to the west. I want to be precise about what it sounded like because I've described it wrong before when I've tried to explain it. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't any kind of animal call I know. The best I can do is imagine a sound that resembles an intake of breath, but slowed down and with a mechanical texture to it, like something grinding at the very low end. It went on for what I clocked as about 12 seconds. I know because I looked at my watch when it started, and I was looking at it when it stopped. 12 seconds is a long time for a breath. I kept walking. I got to the trailhead. Heller was sitting in the truck with the window down, and he said I looked rough, and I told him about the trench under the tent and the circling sounds, and he was quiet for a minute, and then said it sounded like I'd had a long couple of days, and we should get food. Which was the right thing to say. We drove out. I wrote up the road survey and submitted it. I included photographs of the trench marks with a note that origin was undetermined. My committee didn't ask about it. The project passed. I went back and looked at satellite images of that section of ridge. You can access historical imagery through a few different sources. And I found 2 images from the years before that showed what I think are the same kind of marks running across the exposed ground. Not the road, the ground itself, up on the open ridge above tree line. Long parallel lines. Same orientation. The images aren't high enough resolution to measure width. I don't know what leaves a mark like that. I've asked people who know that terrain, and nobody had an explanation that accounted for everything. The spacing, the consistency, the fact that one appeared under a tent that had been staked in place. I've thought about it from a geology angle, some kind of subsurface pressure event, fissuring, but the marks were too regular and too shallow, and they didn't match any surface fracture pattern I'd seen in the literature. The sound I can't account for at all. I've listened to a lot of recordings of things. Industrial equipment, animals, geological events. Nothing matches it. I finished the thesis, and I haven't been back to that area. Heller retired last year. I don't think about it constantly, but it comes up sometimes when I'm doing field work and the noise floor drops out, and I notice it. Then I take stock of where I am and what's around me, and usually it's nothing. It's just a quiet place, and I keep working. That's all I have on it. That's everything I know. My girlfriend at the time worked at a software company, and every year they did a company retreat. That's the setup. She asked me to come along in the summer of 2014, and I said yes because I didn't really have a reason not to. There were 8 of us total. That's the number I want you to hold on to, because it matters later. 8. I counted when we unloaded the cars at the trailhead, because someone made a joke about tents. Something about needing an even number. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but the counting happened, and the number was 8. 2 cars, for people each. Me and Sarah, and 3 of her co-workers in our car. Then 4 more from the other car. I knew Sarah. I knew her co-worker Melissa a little from some work parties I'd tagged along to. The rest I was meeting that weekend for the first time. They all worked in tech. I was doing something in sales at the time, nothing interesting. The whole weekend I was basically nodding along to conversations I didn't follow, and laughing when other people laughed. Someone would say something about a product launch, or a funding round, or whatever, and I'd do the face that said I was keeping up. That's just context for why I wasn't tracking people the way I maybe should have been. I was already a little sideways the whole trip, always half a beat behind, always slightly outside the thing that was happening. The campsite was about a mile in from where we parked. It took 2 trips because there was a lot of gear. We set up tents in the afternoon. We made dinner over the camp stove. Normal stuff. Nothing to tell you about that part. What I want to get to is the fire that night. Everyone was sitting around it, and I was on the outer edge because I'd gotten up to grab a beer, and when I came back someone had shifted into my spot, so I just pulled a log further out and sat there. And at some point I looked around the fire and started counting heads without really meaning to. Maybe because of the tent joke earlier. Maybe just something to do while I wasn't talking. I counted 9. I did it again. 9. I thought I miscounted. I thought Sarah had a friend I'd forgotten about, or someone's partner had come that I'd been told about and then forgot. I was looking at faces trying to remember who was who, and there was this man across the fire in a green rain jacket. I'd seen him earlier, or I thought I had, but I couldn't place exactly when. I figured he'd been in the other car. I figured I'd just missed the introduction and all the unpacking. He was peeling an orange. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He had this way of doing it where he got his thumbnail under the skin at the top, and then went slow, trying to take the whole thing off in one long strip. He was good at it. He'd finish one and set the rind near his foot and start another one. Over the course of the night, he did 4 or 5 of them. There was a little pile next to his chair by the end. I noticed the smell before I noticed the pile. That orange smell was there most of the night, depending on which way the air was moving. I leaned over to Sarah and asked who he was. She looked over at him and said his name. I think she said his name. That's the part one cannot get back no matter how many times I've tried. There's just nothing there. She said something and I nodded and looked back at the fire and figured that was settled. But later I asked Melissa the same question. Not because I was suspicious. Just because I'd already lost the name and I didn't want to spend the rest of the weekend calling him nothing. And Melissa said something like he rode up earlier. Or he came up ahead of us. Something in that direction. Which when I say it now sounds strange because we were all in 2 cars and we all left from the same parking lot, and there wasn't really an earlier to arrive. But at the time it went by. It wasn't the kind of thing you stop and argue when you're at someone else's work party, and you're already the person who doesn't belong there. The man in the green jacket talked a normal amount. He wasn't quiet, and he wasn't loud. He laughed at things that were funny. He had opinions about things people brought up. Someone passed him a beer, and he took it and said something and they laughed. He had his own camp chair, one of those low mesh back ones. I noticed at some point that it was the exact same model as the one Sarah and I had brought, down to the color, and then I stopped thinking about it because it didn't seem like it meant anything. I tried a couple more times to get a handle on where he fit in. I asked Dan, who was one of Sarah's co-workers she'd worked with the longest. I asked him something like, "How do you know the guy in the green jacket?" And Dan said something about how he knows Melissa, and then went straight back to whatever he'd been saying before, like I hadn't asked anything at all. No pause. No looking over at the guy. Just he knows Melissa, and then moving on. So I went back to Melissa later with a different angle and asked how long she'd known him. And she said, "Oh, he's been here the whole time." Like that was an answer to what I asked. Like duration was the same thing as origin. None of that felt alarming when it happened. I want to be clear about that. Every one of those answers slid right past me in the moment. They only started to snag on something when I was lying in the tent later, trying to sleep. Around 10, someone put more wood on the fire. The man in the green jacket was on his 4th or 5th orange. Someone asked him a question. I couldn't hear exactly what, something about a place or maybe a job, and he gave an answer that people nodded at, and then the conversation moved somewhere else pretty quickly. It happened a couple of times. He'd say something, and there'd be this brief moment, and then the group would find a different track. I don't know how to describe it better than that. It wasn't awkward exactly. It was more like switching lanes on a highway, smooth but deliberate. And I noticed, sometime after 11, that nobody had used his name. Not once all night. People talked to him, people handed him things, people responded when he said something. But nobody had turned to him and said, "Hey, so-and-so," the way you do in a group when you're directing something at a specific person. I started listening for it after I noticed. I told myself I was just missing it. I listened for another hour, and I never heard it. By midnight, I was running on nothing. Sarah knew I was done, but she wanted to stay up, and that was fine. I was mostly just sitting there with my head going in circles. Then it started raining. Not a drizzle. Actually raining, the kind that you hear in the leaves about 3 seconds before it reaches you. People moved fast. Chairs got grabbed, bags got scooped up, everyone started heading for tents. Sarah asked me to fold up the camp chairs and stack them under the tarp on the equipment pile before they soaked through. I did that. It took maybe 5 minutes. Folding each chair, stacking them, getting them under the tarp, and weighted down. By the time I was done, the fire was low, and everyone else was inside. I turned back toward the fire, and the man in the green jacket was still in his chair. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting there while the rain came down, and his jacket was getting wet, and he hadn't put his hood up. The fire had dropped a lot in the rain. There wasn't much light. There was something coming off his shoulders. Steam, or something like steam. I've gone back and forth on what that was. It could have been the rain hitting the fabric while it was still warm from being near the fire all night. It could have been condensation or something with the cold air. I don't know. I'm not going to make it into more than I can actually account for. He said something to me. I've been over it enough times that I'm not confident I have the exact words anymore, so I'll just give you the shape of it. He asked if I could help him find where they put him. His campsite. He said he couldn't remember where they put him. I said something back, something easy. I was trying to keep it light. I asked which tent was his. He looked out toward the tree line. Not at the tents, not at me. At the tree line past the edge of the site. And he stayed looking there long enough that I started hearing other things. Just the rain. The rain coming down in the leaves past the tree-line. That's all. Then he said that's what he'd been trying to figure out. I stood there for a while. I don't know how long. Not very long. And then I said something about the rain and went to the tent. I didn't say anything to Sarah that night. I lay there, and I kept thinking I'd find the explanation if I went through it slowly enough. That in the morning there'd be a tent I hadn't seen, or a car parked somewhere I hadn't noticed, and the whole thing would make sense. In the morning there were 8 people. I counted before I let myself think about it. 8. The same 8 who'd driven up the day before. I did not see the green jacket. I did not see the camp chair. I walked over to where he'd been sitting, and the orange rinds were gone. The ground was wet from the rain, and there was nothing there. I don't know if someone cleaned him up first thing or what. I waited all morning to see if anyone would bring him up. While we were making coffee, while we were breaking down the tents, during the walk out to the cars. Nobody said anything. In the car on the way home, I asked Sarah what happened to the guy in the green jacket. She was driving. She looked over at me, and then back at the road, and said, "What guy?" I said the one who was at the fire all night, peeling oranges. She said she didn't know who I was talking about. I said Melissa's friend. I said you told me his name at the beginning of the night. She said I think you're probably mixing him up with Dan, or maybe you were more tired than you realized. She said there wasn't anyone there she didn't know. I dropped it in the car because I didn't want the argument on top of the drive. But a few weeks later I texted Melissa. I said, hey, kind of a random question, but who was the guy at the retreat in the green rain jacket who kept peeling oranges by the fire? I tried to make it casual. She texted back in a few minutes. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I've sat with that for a long time now. I've gone through every version I can think of. Someone I'd never met walked into a private campsite in the middle of the woods and spent an entire night with 8 people who all worked together, and not one of them questioned it, and all of them forgot him by morning. Or all 9 of them were there the whole time, and I miscounted twice, and the explanation is something simple that I'm not seeing. Or something else that I haven't been able to name. I don't know what he was looking for out in those trees. I don't know whose campsite he thought he was in. There was a man camped at Site 14 for about 6 weeks who at some point started saying things he had no way to know, and I have not really talked about it since it happened, so bear with me if I go back and forth a little. This was late 2017. I had taken a seasonal job doing maintenance at a campground in the hills above what they called Merrow County, which is not near anything you would recognize. I had just gone through a divorce and I needed work that came with housing, because the situation with the apartment I was renting had gotten complicated, and the job had a staff trailer on the property, so that covered it. The pay was not good, but the math worked. I mostly did groundskeeping, fire pit cleaning, fixing whatever broke, that kind of thing. The campground was privately owned, not a state park, and most of the guests were regulars who came back the same weeks every year. Families, some retirees, the occasional person traveling alone who just needed a hookup for their rig. The other staff was a guy named Dale. Dale was the head groundskeeper, had been there several seasons already, and he is relevant to this, so I'm telling you now. He was the kind of person who was very quiet until something bothered him, and then he would say one sentence about it and go back to being quiet. He clipped his fingernails with a pocket knife while he was driving, which I never stopped finding strange no matter how many times I saw it. So there was a man at Site 14. He had been there when I arrived in late June, and he was still there into August. That is a long stay, but the owner allowed long-term rates if someone paid in advance, and the man had done that apparently. I only knew what Dale told me, which was not much. The man drove a red pickup, mid-90s, kept it very clean. He wore iron jeans every day, which at a campground you notice. White mustache. Retired looking, I do not know how else to put it. He had a pop-up camper, not a big rig, and he kept his site tidy. He always waved first when you drove past, so Dale had started calling him the mayor, which was not mean, just something Dale said. I had talked to him maybe twice. Once when I was checking the water hookups on his row, and once when he came into the camp office to buy a bag of ice. Normal exchanges. He asked how I was settling in. I said fine, that was it. The thing that started it was the cleats. I was behind the office counter one afternoon, must have been early August, and he came in again, I think for firewood tokens or something like that. And while I was getting them, he said something like, "Does your daughter still play soccer?" And he said it the way you say something to keep a conversation going, not like he was asking something he did not know the answer to. Casual, like we had talked about my daughter before, which we had not. There was a soda cooler behind me that had a compressor that rattled. I remember hearing it. I asked him what he meant, and he said he had seen little cleats hanging from my rearview mirror earlier in the summer, and figured I had a kid who played. And he kind of shrugged when he said it, like it was nothing. Here's the thing. I had cleats hanging from my mirror at one point. Little shin guards, actually, my daughter's. She had left them in my car the last time I saw her before the divorce proceedings got bad, and I stopped having regular visits. I had moved them from the car into a storage tote that was in my apartment back, where I used to live 2 counties over, before I took this job. They were not in my car when I drove to this campground. I am certain about that because I remember taking them out specifically. I did not want to look at them on a long drive, so they were not on my mirror when I arrived. They were not on my mirror at any point I was at this campground, and I had not told anyone about my daughter, not the owner, not Dale, not anyone. I did not say any of this to him. I said something like, "Oh yeah," and gave him the tokens, and he left. I went outside after a few minutes and looked at my car. Nothing on the mirror. I did not do anything about it right away because I could not figure out what I would even say or to whom. I thought maybe he had seen me somewhere before, some parking lot, some gas station, somewhere between where I used to live and where I was now. I tried to make that work. It mostly did not work because I had not driven through anywhere with enough stops for someone to see my car and then end up at the same campground. But I tried to make it work anyway. The next thing was smaller and took me longer to be sure about. I started noticing that things in my trailer were not where I left them. Not taken. Nothing was missing that I could find. Just moved. My toothbrush would be damp in the morning when I had not used it since the night before. I would leave my work boots by the door, and one would be upright and one tipped on its side, and I was fairly sure I left them both the same way. A spoon in the dish rack facing the wrong direction, which sounds like nothing, but I have a habit of putting utensils a specific way, and I noticed. Each of these things alone I would have explained away. I did explain them away several times for several days. I thought I was not sleeping well, that I was misremembering things. The divorce had not been clean, and I was aware that my head was not entirely right that year. So I kept explaining it, and the things kept happening, and eventually I had explained it enough times that I could not keep doing it. I did not have a lock on the trailer that I had put there myself. There was a lock on the door, but the key had been made available to the owner and to Dale because it was a staff trailer and they needed access sometimes for maintenance, and I did not know if copies had been made before I got there or who might have one. I asked Dale if anyone else had a key, and he said not that he knew of. I started doing small things to check. I would put a piece of tape across the inside of a cabinet at an angle, so I would know if it had been opened. I would lay a hair across the inside of my boot. Things I had seen in a movie probably. Half of them I forgot about and disturbed myself, and then could not remember if I had done it or someone else had. The tape on the cabinet I was careful about, and it came off twice over about 3 weeks when I had not opened it. During this time I watched Site 14. I did not do anything formal about it. I just started paying attention to when the red pickup was there and when it was not. He left most mornings around 8 and came back in the afternoon. Sometimes he left again in the evening. He did not seem to go anywhere in particular, or not that I could track. I did not follow him. I thought about mentioning something to the owner, but I did not know what to say that would not sound like I was accusing a paying long-term guest of something I had no proof of. One night, it was a weeknight, the campground was maybe a third full. I was doing my last loop of the fire pits around 9:30. I came around behind the staff housing row, which was just my trailer and a storage shed, and there were tire tracks in the dirt behind the trailer that went back into the tree line. There is no road back there. There is no campsite back there. The tracks went in and they came back out, and they matched the width of a pickup. I went and got Dale. He was still in the equipment shed, which he sometimes was late. I showed him the tracks. He looked at them for a while, and then he said, without looking up from the pocket knife he was working on his nails with, he said that the man in 14 was not supposed to be camping this close to staff housing anymore. And then he did not say anything else. I asked him what he meant by anymore, and he said there had been a situation with a previous staff member, a woman who had worked the summer before me, and the owner had asked the man to move his site. His original site had been closer. He was at 14 now because 14 was farther from the trailer. I asked Dale what the situation was. He said he did not know the details. I did not believe him entirely, but I did not push it because Dale was not someone you pushed. I went back to the owner the next day and asked whether there was anything I should know about the man in 14. The owner was not unfriendly about it. She said he was a good guest, paid on time, kept a clean site, had been coming for several years. She said there had been a misunderstanding with a previous employee, but that it had been resolved. She did not tell me what the misunderstanding was. I asked if the man had ever been given a key to the staff trailer for any reason. She said no. She said that trailer key was only her and Dale and me. I asked if I could change the lock. She said she would look into it. She did not follow up on that before the end of the season. The man in 14 checked out about 2 weeks before the campground closed for the season. He came in and settled his account and was friendly about it. He told me it had been a good summer. He said he might see me next year. I did not say anything back to that except to say to have a safe drive. After he left, I walked over to Site 14 and looked around. He had cleaned it well, better than most guests. Fire pit cleared out, ground raked. I looked at the site for a while, but I do not know what I was looking for. There was nothing to find. I finished out the season and did not go back the following year. I told the owner in October that I would not be returning, and she said that was fine and thanked me for the work. I thought about calling the previous employee, the woman who had the job before me. I found a first name from Dale, which was all he knew or would give me. I did not find her. I do not know if I tried hard enough to find her or if I just stopped. The cleats are still in the storage tote at my old apartment, as far as I know. I have not gotten them out. I do not know how he knew about them. I have gone through it enough times that I have run out of ways to explain it that hold up. The most I can say is that I do not know. Someone knew things and moved things in a place where I slept, and I cannot tell you who for certain, which I know is not a satisfying place to leave it, but that is where it is. My brother had been watching survival videos for most of 2020, and by January he had decided he could winter camp. That's what you need to know first. He wasn't an outdoorsman. He worked at an auto parts store in Duluth. He had a lot of time that year, and he went down some kind of rabbit hole and came out the other side thinking he knew things. You know how that went for people. Long stretches of nothing to do, and the internet just sitting there. Hotels were either shut or close to it by then. You remember how that was. So when he said he wanted to camp, I didn't have my usual argument ready. Normally I would have said, let's just book somewhere, let's get a cabin, something. But there wasn't anywhere to go, and he'd been alone in that apartment since the spring. I said yes mostly because I was worried about him. That's the honest version. He'd found a spot north of Superior through some forum. He had coordinates on his phone and a list of gear, and he'd already ordered most of it before he asked me. I figured that out when the packages started showing up at my place because he didn't have room in his. New sleeping bags, both of them. A 4-season tent. A propane lantern. Hand warmers in bulk. He'd been planning it for a while before he brought it up. We drove up in my truck. The last part of the road hadn't been plowed all the way, and we slid a few times on packed ice. We parked where the road ended and hiked in. Half a mile, maybe a little more. The snow was the dry kind you get when it's been cold for a long time. Not the wet packing snow. When you walked on it, it made a sound. A tight sound. My brother said that was a sign of how cold it actually was. That snow makes that sound at a certain temperature. And he said the temperature like I'd be impressed by it. He timed himself putting up the tent. He pulled his gloves off and handed them to me, and started on the poles and counted out loud. He'd practiced in his apartment. He told me that later. He'd set it up on his living room floor to get the time down. I was trying to get the sleeping pads unrolled, and my hands were already going slow. He finished and called out his time, and I didn't respond because I was focused on not dropping things. He grinned through all of it. That was the whole trip for him. The colder it got, the more he grinned. He had this idea about it, about showing that you could be out in something serious and be fine. He'd say things like, this is manageable, or your body adjusts. He said that a lot. Your body adjusts. We ate dinner out of pouches. He'd planned the calories. He'd researched how many you burn keeping warm, and had accounted for it. He talked about that while we ate. By the time we were inside the tent, it was full dark. The temperature had dropped more. I had on everything I'd brought, base layer, wool over that, down jacket inside the sleeping bag with me. My brother had on fewer layers, and was aware of it. He mentioned it more than once. I didn't think I'd sleep. I was wrong. I went out fast. I woke up, and I don't know what time it was. My phone was inside my jacket to keep the battery from going, and I didn't want to move enough to get it. The lantern had burned down to maybe a third of what it had been. My brother was asleep beside me. I could hear him breathing through his mouth the way he does. The tent wall was moving, not from wind. I need to say that clearly because tent fabric does specific things in wind. It flaps. It gets pushed in one direction and held there. This was different. One panel of the tent came in slowly, maybe 4 or 5 inches, and then stopped, and then went back out. I lay still. It happened again. Same panel. Same slow push in, and then it released. I told myself it was snow accumulation on the sidewall. That's a real thing. Weight builds on a vertical surface, and the fabric responds. I've camped enough to know a tent does things at night that surprise you. But accumulated snow doesn't release. It doesn't press in and then draw back. Outside there was a sound. I want to be careful about how I describe it, because I'm not sure sound is the right word. It was more like the absence of the sound the snow had been making all day when we walked on it. A compression. A settling. Like weight being placed and then shifted. It was moving around the tent. I tracked it by that, by where the settling came from, and by which walls of the tent changed. It went past the back corner, and I lost it for a moment, and then I heard it on the other side and watched that wall. The fabric moved. Not as much as the first side, but it moved. The lantern made everything inside the tent the color of old paper. Through the walls I could see the shadows of trees, dark against the white, and nothing else. I think it went around twice. I was not tracking time well, and I kept losing it when it went past the back of the tent. There was a section behind us where there were more trees, and I couldn't hear it as well. It stopped at the front of the tent, near the door, near where the zipper pull was hanging down on the inside. Nothing happened then. Just stopped. I could hear the lake. At night in that kind of cold the ice shifts, and the sound carries a long way. I heard that. I heard my brother breathing. I couldn't hear anything directly outside the tent. Not breathing, not movement, not anything. I reached for the zipper. My brother's hand closed around my wrist before I touched it. His eyes were open. He'd been awake the whole time, or at least long enough to have figured something out. He turned his head toward me very slowly, and he said something about staying still, about not letting whatever was out there know we were awake. He said it quietly, but not in a scared way. He said it the way you tell someone not to touch a hot burner. Decided. Already past the part where you think about it. I put my hand back down. The front wall of the tent came in hard then. The whole panel. Something pressed into it from outside, and the fabric came in until the top seam opened, and snow fell through in a line across my brother's sleeping bag. Just poured in like powder, and sat there on the fabric of the bag. Then it went back out. The wall went back to where it was supposed to be, and the opening at the top closed up. We lay there. I checked my phone eventually. For in the morning. I don't know when I first woke up. I don't know how long the circling lasted. I don't know how long I was awake before I reached for the zipper. Nothing else happened. I mean that directly. No more sounds, no more movement in the walls. We lay there, and it got light, and my brother got up and started breaking down the tent. When I asked him what he thought it was, he said he didn't know. He was already pulling the poles. I asked had he seen anything, and he said no. He kept moving. I've seen him move like that after things happen that he doesn't want to talk about. Fast, focused, task to task. Outside I walked around the tent and looked at the snow. There were no tracks. I want to be precise about that because it sounds like I'm trying to say something I'm not. I'm saying I looked for them and didn't find them. The snow close in to the tent was disturbed, compressed in different ways, but we had walked all around the tent when we set it up and staked it, so that could have been us. 6 feet out, maybe 8, the surface was smooth. I looked for a pattern. Tracks have a pattern. Paws or hooves, something that repeats at intervals. I walked the perimeter further out, maybe 15 feet from the tent on all sides, and I looked. Nothing I could identify. My brother was already at the trailhead with both packs. I had to walk fast to catch up. We drove most of the way home without talking. He had the heat on high. Around Duluth, he said we probably should have brought a gun, and I said probably. That was it for the drive. About a year later I asked him about it again. He said he'd looked into the animals up there. He went through a list. Moose. Black bear, though they're denayed up in January. He mentioned wolves, but said it didn't fit. I asked him what didn't fit, and he said the way it moved. He said you can hear wolves. They make noise, they communicate with each other. There's always sound with a pack. He said this was quiet in a way that didn't fit that. He also said the size of whatever it was. The way the tent moved. He said he kept going back to that. I've gone back to it too. I bought a different tent after that, not the same one. We left the one up north when we packed out. We just left it. Neither of us said anything about it, we just didn't take it. I've pushed on the wall of my tent from the inside. I wanted to know how hard you have to push to make the front panel bow in like that, far enough to split the seam and let snow through. You need more than one hand. I mean more than one person's hand. I'm not small. I don't know what to do with that. I keep running through the list of things it could have been. I add things, I take things off. I think about the snow being smooth that far out from the tent, and I try to find an explanation for that, for something large enough to do what it did to the front wall without leaving a clear track pattern. I don't have one that works. My brother is fine, as far as I can tell. He's not doing the survival stuff anymore. He got into woodworking. He posts about it. He seems like himself. The thing I think about most is what he said when he grabbed my wrist. About not letting it know we were awake. I think about how he said it. Not like he was working it out. Already worked out. I've tried to figure out when he actually woke up. Whether it was when the tent first moved, or whether he was awake before that. Whether he heard it before I did, and lay there with his eyes closed for all of it. I asked him that time we talked. I asked when he woke up. He said he wasn't sure he ever fully went back to sleep. That's what I keep coming back to. Not the tent, not the sound. Just him lying there with his eyes shut, already knowing not to move, not waking me, just waiting. For how long I don't know. I still haven't asked him why he didn't wake me up. I'm not sure I want to know what he'd say. My wife set up the trip. That is the first thing. I was 6 months out of a program in Marin, and she had done most of the carrying that year. And the glamping thing was her idea of a reset, her word. And I went along with it because I was still in the part of recovery where you say yes to things and try to mean it. The place was on the coast, maybe 2 hours north of the city. Coastal glamping is what the website called it. Canvas tents on wooden platforms, which is just camping with better sheets and a price tag that makes it feel like something else. There were 4 tents total on the property. Ours was closest to the main house where the owner, a man named Paul, made coffee in the mornings and left wine on a little folding table outside each tent at check-in. The older couple from Seattle were in the tent next to ours. I only ever knew them as the couple from Seattle because that is what Paul called them when he mentioned them, friendly, gray-haired. They walked the beach every morning and went to bed early. Tent 3 and Tent 4 was up closer to the cliff path, set back from the others in a way that made it a little separate from the rest of the property. There was a man staying in Tent 4. That is what Paul said the first morning. He poured coffee and mentioned him, the quiet guy in Tent 4, said it the way you mention a piece of furniture, just noting that it existed. I did not think much of it. I took my coffee and went back to the tent, and my wife was reading in bed, and I remember I sat on the edge of the platform and looked at the property and tried to figure out which tent was for, and I thought I could see it back by the tree line, set apart. I did not see the man that day. Not clearly. I saw boots outside the communal washroom, work boots, not hiking boots, the kind a person wears when they are doing something actual. I noticed them because they were facing outward, which is not how you leave boots when you go in. Usually you toe them off and they end up pointed any direction. These were pointed out like whoever left them had stepped out of them facing the door and walked back and backward, which does not make sense, but that is what I saw. That afternoon I was walking back from the dunes, and I saw a hand holding a cigarette near the path. Just the hand and the cigarette, the rest of the person behind a privacy screen they had set up outside the tent. The smoke was going straight up because there was no wind right then. I slowed down a little. The hand did not move except to bring the cigarette down and hold it. I kept walking. That night at dinner, which was outside at the communal table, the couple from Seattle were there, and Paul came out and sat for a few minutes, and my wife had the wine because I do not drink, and the man from Tent 4 was not there. I asked Paul about him. I said something like, "Is the guy in 4 not joining us?" And Paul said he usually kept to himself, and my wife said, "What guy?" And I said the guy in the 4th tent, and she said she had not seen anyone in any of the other tents except the couple from Seattle. I told her Paul had mentioned him that morning. She said she did not remember that. Paul had already gone back inside. I did not bring it up again that night. The second morning I saw the outline of him at breakfast. I say outline because that is actually the right word. He was sitting at the far end of the communal table, away from the couple from Seattle, and the gulls were loud that morning, coming in low over the table. And he was just sitting, not eating anything I could see, just facing the water. I looked at him, and then looked away, and then looked back, and he was still sitting the same way. My wife was talking to the woman from Seattle about a pottery class she took in Marin, and I was watching the man at the end of the table, and I could not have told you anything about his face because of the way the light was coming in off the water behind him. I told my wife about it after breakfast. I said the guy was there at the table. I pointed to where he had been. She said she had been sitting right there and had not seen anyone else. She was not dismissive about it. She was just saying what she saw. I went to find Paul. He was in the kitchen. I asked him how long the man in Tent 4 was staying. Was he there through the weekend? Paul looked at me, not like he was confused, more like he was trying to figure out what I was asking. He said, "Which tent?" I said Tent 4, the quiet guy. You mentioned him yesterday morning. Paul said he had not mentioned anyone. He said it straight, no hedging. He said the only guests on the property were my wife and me, and the couple from Seattle. I said he had told me. He said he did not remember saying that. I went back to the tent. My wife was making the bed, which is a thing she does even in tents, and I sat on the edge of the platform and looked at the property. I could see Tent 4 from where I was. The flap was closed. Nothing outside it. I want to be clear about the jacket. I have one jacket I wear almost every day, a wax canvas thing I bought maybe 4 years ago. It has a collar that stands up and one sleeve has a tear near the wrist where I caught it on a fence post, a clean tear that I never got fixed. I had it in my bag on the trip, but I was not wearing it that second day because the weather was better. That night I could not sleep. The heater in the tent kept cycling on and off, not breaking, just doing what it does, and my wife was asleep with one arm over her eyes like she does, and the ocean was loud, not crashing, more like a low steady sound, like something pressing in and out through the rocks. Not wave sound. Different from that. Someone was walking outside between the tents. I lay still and listened. The footsteps were slow, and there was a pause between each one. Dry grass or gravel, not wet, and the pauses were long enough that I kept thinking they had stopped. I got up without waking my wife, and went to the seam in the canvas by the door, the place where the two sides overlap, and you can see out without opening anything. There was enough moon to see the fire pit, which was about 15 feet out from the platform. There was a man standing near the fire pit. He was wearing my jacket. I know what my jacket looks like. The collar was up, and the tear was visible near the wrist, even from where I was, that pale edge of the lining showing through. He was facing away from me, toward the water. I stood there for a while. He did not move. He just stood there facing the water the way you stand when you are waiting for something. Then he said something. He said it quietly, not loud, not to anyone in particular as far as I could tell, just out in front of him toward the water. He said, "You told her you only blacked out once." I did not go outside. I stood at the seam in the canvas and did not move, and after a while the man was not there. I do not mean he walked away. I mean I was looking at him, and then I was not. I went back to the bed. My wife turned over and asked if I was okay, and I said yes, and she went back to sleep. In the morning my jacket was hanging on the hook inside the tent where I had put it when we arrived. I checked the sleeve. The tear was there. I did not tell my wife about the man, or what he said. I have not told her. What he said is something only I know, and I do not know how he could have known it. I said once to her, during a conversation in a parking lot outside the intake building, that there had been one blackout, one incident, and that was the word I used, incident, and that was a number I chose because it was smaller than the actual number, and she was standing there waiting to understand whether to stay. I am not saying the man was real. I am not saying he was not. I am saying I saw him and I heard him, and I do not have another way to account for it. We checked out the next morning. Paul said it was a pleasure, hoped we enjoyed ourselves, hoped we would come back. The couple from Seattle were loading their car. Tent 4 was closed up tight, no boots outside, no sign of anyone. On the way home my wife asked if I had slept okay, and I said mostly. She said she thought the heater was what kept waking her up. I said probably. I have looked at the booking confirmation a few times since then. It lists 2 guests. Not 3, not 4. 2. I do not know what I think about the blackouts now. I mean, I know how many there were. I know I knew when I said what I said in the parking lot. I have thought a lot about why a person does that, says a smaller number. And I think mostly it is because you believe the smaller number is still enough to be honest while also being survivable, which is a thing you can tell yourself. I do not know what the man near the fire pit was. I have thought about whether I made him up somehow, whether 6 months out of a program a person can do something like that, and I honestly do not know the answer to that. My wife still talks about that trip sometimes. She says it was exactly what she needed. She says she slept better there than she had in years. I do not know what to do with any of that. My son was 12 that summer, and his mother had just remarried. That's context you need. I had him alternate weekends, and I was not handling any of it well. I thought a camping trip would help. I don't know with what exactly. I picked Blackwater Ridge because I'd heard the name somewhere, and it sounded like the kind of place a father takes a kid. We got there Friday afternoon. More crowded than I expected, more RVs, generators going on half the sites. I hadn't camped since my late 20s, and I'd forgotten how tent poles work. There are too many of them, and they all look the same until they don't fit. And then you're standing there in front of your kid, looking like you don't know what you're doing, which I didn't. That's when the guy came over. He had a sunburned neck and a camouflage hat, and he was carrying one of those stainless steel mugs, the kind people carry everywhere like it says something about them. He helped with the poles. He got the tent up in about 4 minutes, and while he was doing it he used my son's name. Just said it, like he already knew it. I told myself he'd overheard it. We'd been walking around for maybe 20 minutes before we found our site, and my son and I had been talking the whole time. People overhear things. That's a thing that happens. He offered us firewood that evening. We had our own, but he brought extra anyway and stacked it by the ring without asking if we wanted it. Then he showed my son how to tie fishing knots. My son took to it right away, which is not something my son does. He hangs back. He always hangs back. He hung back for maybe 3 seconds with this guy, and then he was sitting right beside him watching his hands. I stayed where I was. The guy wasn't doing anything wrong. That's the thing I kept coming back to. Showing a kid a knot is not a wrong thing. Saturday was mostly fine. We fished in the morning, and my son caught something small and threw it back and seemed okay with that. We ate the sandwiches I packed. In the afternoon I tried to teach him to read a trail map, and he got bored fast, which is fair. I was trying too hard with most of it, and I knew it while I was doing it. The whole weekend felt like something I was building toward a point I hadn't figured out yet. Saturday evening the campground got loud. More people had come in, generators on more sites, somebody cooking onions close enough that you could smell it. The air had gotten heavy. I remember noticing that. The guy showed up at our site around 7. He was carrying hot dogs. We had not asked for hot dogs. He didn't ask if we wanted them. He just set them down on the table and sat down on the log across the fire from me and my son. He sat like he'd been there before. He started talking. I'm not going to try to get it exactly right because I don't want to get it wrong, but it was about custody. His own situation, which had apparently gone bad. He used a phrase about women and boys that I don't want to repeat. My son was sitting there staring at the fire the whole time. Not at the guy, at the fire. I couldn't tell if he was listening. I told the guy we were turning in early. I said it more than once before he stood up. He picked up his mug and looked across the fire at me, and said something about my son having mentioned that I was a deep sleeper. That was the word he used. He said my son told him I sleep deep. He left after that. My son was right there when he said it. I did not ask my son about it, not right then. We got in the tent, and I checked the zipper. I checked it 3 times. I kept thinking I hadn't done it, right, even though I could see it was closed. My son fell asleep fast. He always sleeps hard outside. I lay there. I don't know what time I fell asleep. What woke me was movement. Not a loud sound. Pine needles have a specific sound when someone is walking on them slowly, a dry shifting, and this was slow. Not someone passing by. Someone close to the tent, moving one direction, and then stopping, and then moving again. I lay still and listened to see if it would stop or go somewhere. It didn't stop. It stayed close. Then my son was awake. I could tell he was awake before he said anything. He whispered that the guy had our cooler. I got out of the tent. I don't remember deciding to. I was just outside. The campground was dark, generators off, most lights out. Our fire was almost nothing. The guy was standing at the cooler, which was maybe 15 feet from the tent, and he had the lid open, and when I came out he looked up at me. He said something. It was casual. It was the kind of thing someone says when they've been caught, but don't think it counts as being caught. He reached into the cooler and took one of our beers and held it up a little and turned and walked back toward his site. I stood there and watched him go. I did not say anything. I did not follow him. I went back and got in the tent and zipped it and lay down. My son didn't say anything. I didn't either. I could tell he was still awake for a while. At some point I was asleep because morning happened. In the morning the guy's tent was gone. He'd broken camp before I woke up. His site had that flat look sites get after someone leaves. We drove home. My son slept most of the way. I didn't bring up the night before and neither did he. 3 hours in the car and I never asked. Here's the part I've gone back to, and I don't have a way to settle it. The name. The first time he used my son's name, before we'd been introduced, we had been on that site for maybe 15 or 20 minutes. My son does not introduce himself to strangers. He's not a shy kid, but he doesn't do that, never has. I don't know when they would have spoken before the guy came over to help with the tent. I've tried to put the timeline together, and I can't get it to work. The knots. My son needed me to show him how to ride a bike 4 or 5 separate times over 2 weeks. With this guy he watched once, and then he was doing it. I've tried to decide if that's just how some people teach, if some people are better at showing than others. Maybe that's it. The sleep comment. I didn't ask my son to explain it. 3 hours in the car, and I kept thinking I'd bring it up, and I never did. I don't know why I didn't. I went back to that campground twice after, both times with my son, because I thought if I didn't it would mean something. The guy wasn't there either time. I don't know if he camped there regularly, or just came through. He never told us his last name. I don't think he had one to give us as far as the conversation went. The cooler I've explained to myself different ways. Drunk and thought it was his. Didn't care that it wasn't. Someone who operates like the rules don't apply to him and got casual when someone came out. That's probably what it was. Except I didn't actually say anything when I came out. I just stood there. And he didn't apologize or put it back, he just took the beer and left, and the thing is he did it slowly. He wasn't startled. He took his time. My son is 29 now, and lives in Portland, and we talk most weeks. I have not brought any of this up to him as an adult. I don't know if he remembers that weekend, or if it's just a weekend to him now. I've gotten close to asking, and then I don't. I don't know what I'm saying exactly. I guess it stayed with me, and I can't get it to sit right, and usually things sit right eventually if you leave them alone long enough. This one I've left alone for a long time, and it's still the same when I look at it. That's about all I've got. So we were doing a plumbing contract job, me and two guys I work with, Marcus and Dale. Commercial work, nothing special, a restaurant build out about 4 hours from home. We'd been out there 3 days already. The night I'm talking about we couldn't get a motel. There was some music festival in the area, I don't remember which one, and every room within 50 miles was gone. Marcus looked it up on his phone for probably 20 minutes before he gave up. Dale said he had a 2-man tent in the truck bed that he always kept back there, and I had a sleeping bag I used for ice fishing, so we just found the nearest campground on the map and went there. It was a state campground, pull-off spots along a river. Not a nice place. Just gravel and fire pit rings, and a bathroom building that I don't think had running water. We paid at an iron box by the entrance, the kind where you put cash in an envelope. $12 a spot. We took 2 spots next to each other, and Marcus slept in the truck cab. The people across from us I noticed right away. Not because anything happened, just because they were off. They had 3 tents lined up in a row, all the same color, and a black cargo trailer parked tight behind the tents. The kind of trailer you'd haul equipment in. No plates on it, or if there were I couldn't see them. They had no camp chairs, no cooler sitting out, no lantern, none of the stuff you'd normally see. There were at least 3 men, maybe 4. They moved around quietly, and none of them was talking that I heard. Dale made a joke that they looked military. I didn't say anything back. I don't know why I didn't. It just didn't seem funny to me, for some reason I couldn't explain at the time. It got dark early because of the trees, and I walked down to the river to clean up. I'd been working with pipe sealant most of the day, and it was in the creases of my hands, and I wanted to get it off before I ate. The river was maybe 150 feet from our spots, a little path worn down to it. The water was cold and smelled like mud and something else, like gasoline almost. I don't know if that was the water or something upstream. I was crouched down scrubbing my hands, and I looked downstream without really meaning to, and I saw something in the brush on the bank. Bags. Heavy-duty contractor bags, the black ones, piled up in the brush maybe 30 feet from me. 6 of them maybe. They weren't buried or anything. They were just set in the brush a little back from the waterline, where you wouldn't see them if you weren't right there at the bank. I want to be clear about something. I was not trying to find anything. I was not looking around. I looked downstream, and they were just there. I probably would have left it alone. I don't go looking for things that aren't my business, and I've been doing this work long enough to know that you see stuff sometimes, and the right move is to not see it. But one of the bags had split or been opened, and was sitting different from the others, kind of folded over, and I could see inside it from where I was. Phones. A lot of phones. The kind you'd buy prepaid at a drugstore, still in the plastic packaging or out of it and stacked. And charging cables in bundles with those little rubber bands around them. Not thrown in. Set in. That's the word I keep coming back to. They were set in there. I was still crouched down looking at this when I heard someone behind me. They said, "You lost." Not like a question. More like they were just saying it out loud to see how I'd respond to it. The voice was even. It wasn't loud. I stood up and turned around, and one of the men from across the campground was standing there with a flashlight, pointing it down at the ground between us. Not at me. At the ground. He had mud on his jeans almost to the knee, like he'd been standing in the river or somewhere wet for a while. I said no, and he didn't say anything. I told him I was cleaning up, gestured at the water. He nodded. I walked back to our spots. I didn't walk fast. I don't know why that mattered to me, but I didn't walk fast. Marcus and Dale were already packing. Not talking, just doing it. Dale was breaking down the 2-man tent he'd set up. Marcus had his sleeping bag stuffed under his arm. I asked what was going on, and Dale talked low, not quite a whisper but close. He told me while I was down at the river 2 men came over to our spots. Not the same man I'd just talked to. Different ones. He said they asked questions. About our truck, the make, the color. About who we worked for. And then whether anyone was expecting us in the morning, or knew where we were that night. I remember he stopped after that last part, and didn't say anything else for a second. I don't know who those questions make sense for. A neighbor who's being friendly, a security guy, someone who's paranoid about their site being disturbed. I can see a version of all of those. But those three questions together in that order don't make sense for any of those people. We had the gear in the trucks in maybe 10 minutes. Not running, just moving. Before we got in, I looked across at their site. The headlights on the cargo trailer came on. Not the engine, just the lights. And they weren't pointed toward the road out of the campground. They were pointed across at our spots. We drove out. Marcus went first, and I followed him. I watched the mirror until we were back on the highway, and the campground wasn't visible anymore. We drove until we found a truck stop with a parking lot big enough to sleep in, and we stayed there. I slept about 2 hours in the cab. We were back at the job site by 6 in the morning, and nobody said much about it. Here's the thing I've gone back to. The man by the river, the one who came down while I was at the water. He had mud on his jeans that high. That campground, the bank there, the ground near the water was firm. I was crouched right at the edge, and I didn't get muddy. So wherever he'd been standing before he came to find me, it wasn't at that bank. I looked up the campground a few weeks later, and it didn't have a name. It wasn't listed anywhere I could find. The address on the Iron Pay box was just a county road number. I don't know if that means anything. The phones bother me most. Not because of what they were, but because of how they were kept. Organized like that, in bags by a river. Not thrown away, not destroyed. Just stored there, like someone was going to come back for them. I don't know what we walked into. I've thought about it enough times that I don't think about it the same way every time. But those questions they asked Dale, whether anyone knew where we were, that's the one I can't find a way to make ordinary. We finished the job the next 2 days and drove home. I haven't been back to that area.